She stood in the middle of my living room with papers scattered all across the coffee table, and her face had gone the color of old drywall. My son sat frozen on the couch beside her, staring at his own hands like he'd never seen them before. And me, I was standing by the fireplace with a folder in my grip, and I heard my own voice come out flat and hard, a voice I didn't recognize. Who's assigned my name some Sloan? Go on. Say it out loud. Because I've been holding a chisel for 50 years, and I know my own signature. And that ain't it. Delia slid the handwriting report across the table. The bedroom door creaked open behind me, and a woman in a gray blazer stepped out with a badge clipped to her belt. And my daughter-in-law, the woman who not long before that had told me I was too old to keep my own house, opened her mouth and nothing came out. Not one word. My name is Marlene Whitaker. I'm 72 years old. I've been a carpenter my whole life. And that morning, I found out the person my son married had been trying to steal everything I own right out from under me. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments. And please, stay with me until the end. Because not long before that morning, I still thought the worst thing that would ever happen to me had already come and gone. I buried my husband 4 years back. I figured a woman doesn't get handed much worse than that. I was wrong, and it took my own boy walking through my kitchen door to teach me how wrong. Let me take you back. I live at the end of Sumner Road, out on the western edge of a little town called Cutter's Grove. 3 acres mostly. A white farmhouse my husband Tom and I bought 40 years ago when the paint was peeling and the porch sagged like a tired mule. We fixed it up slow, room by room, because slow was all we could afford back then. There's a workshop out back that I built with my own 2 hands the summer I was carrying Elliot. A real shop, cedar walls, a wood stove in the corner, and a workbench so worn smooth in the middle that it shines when the afternoon light hits it right. I still go out there every day. A woman my age, you either keep your hands busy or your hands start to shake. So I keep them busy. I ought to tell you about the shop, because damn near everything that matters in this story starts and ends out there among the sawdust. 41 years ago, when the doctor told us I was carrying, I didn't buy a crib. I built one. And I built something else too, a little rocking chair, sized for a child. Oak with a curved back and slats I steamed and bent by hand over 3 straight weekends. I burned 4 letters into the underside of the seat where nobody would ever look. E, J, W. And under that, a date. Elliot James Whitaker. My son, born the second week of a cold October, red-faced and hollering. And I remember holding him in that shop with the wood glue still tacky on my fingers and thinking there wasn't a thing in this world I wouldn't build for that boy. He grew up in the smell of that place, cedar and pine and the sharp bite of varnish. When he was small, he'd sit in that rocking chair for hours while I worked, asking me why the grain runs the way it runs, why some wood splits mean and some wood bends sweet. I taught him the difference between a job done fast and a job done right. Taught him that a joint held together with glue and prayer comes apart, but a joint cut proper, mortise and tenon, wood locked into wood, that only holds tighter the more weight you put on it. He soaked it all up back then. My boy. My whole heart walking around outside my body. Tom used to laugh and say, I love that workshop more than I love the house. He wasn't entirely wrong. The house is where we lived. The shop is where I became somebody. Elliot did good for himself. A smart kid, worked hard, put himself through medical school on loans and stubbornness. Tom and I were so proud we could have burst. He opened a family practice a couple towns over, the kind of clinic where you know your patients by their first names and you remember which ones are scared of needles. For a while there, everything was the way you dream it'll be when you're young and holding a newborn in a sawdust shop. Then he met Sloan. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I hated her from the jump. That'd be a lie. And I promised myself when I started telling this thing, I'd tell it straight. She was sharp, polished, the kind of woman who shakes your hand and looks you dead in the eye and makes you feel like you just passed some test you didn't know you were taking. She managed money for a living, Wealth management, she called it. And she talked about people's houses and savings the way I talk about lumber. Board feet. Market value. What a thing is worth if you cut it up and sell it off. Tom saw it before I did. He always did. After the wedding, he pulled me aside in this very kitchen and he said, "Marlene, that girl looks at our house like she's already got a buyer lined up." I told him he was being an old worrier. I told him Elliot was happy and that was enough for me. God, I wish I'd listened. My husband had a nose for people that I never had, and he spent the last years of his life quietly watching our son drift somewhere I couldn't follow. After Tom passed, the drifting got worse. The Sunday calls turned into every other Sunday, then into a text here and there. "How you holding up, Mom? Busy week. Talk soon." My granddaughter Junie was born. This tiny, fierce little thing with her grandfather's exact frown. And I'd see her maybe once every couple months if I was lucky. And always with Sloan hovering close by like I might drop the child or say the wrong thing. The last time they came for supper, before all this started, Sloan spent the whole meal on her phone. And when I asked how the clinic was doing, something flickered across her face. Just for a second. And she asked me, real casual, whether I'd ever thought about how much land like mine was going for these days. I should have heard it then. The sound a person makes when they stop seeing your home and start seeing a number. But I was an old woman missing my husband, glad just to have my boy and my grandbaby at my table, and I let it slide right past me. I keep coming back to something my father told me when I was maybe 19, green as spring wood, ruining a good piece of walnut because I was rushing. He took the plane out of my hand and he said, "Marlene, wood doesn't lie. You force it. It fights you. You listen to it. It gives you everything. People are the same damn way," he said. "Only most folks never learn to listen till the piece is already split." I didn't understand him then. I do now. Because not long before I stood in that living room asking my daughter-in-law, whose hand had signed my name, it was an ordinary Tuesday morning. Coffee in my chipped mug, the good light coming through the kitchen window, the way it does that time of year, low and gold across the floorboards. I had a set of chair legs clamped up drying out in the shop, and my whole plan for the day was to sand them down and start on the joinery. That was it. That was the whole plan. And then I heard a car turn in off Sumner Road. Not slow, the way you pull in when you're coming to visit somebody you love. Fast, loose gravel spitting up under the tires. The engine cut hard, and two doors slammed, one right after the other, and I stood there at my own counter with my coffee going cold in my hand, and something in my chest went tight before I even knew why. That was the morning my son and his wife walked into my kitchen to tell me I was done living in my own house. They didn't knock. That was the first thing. 40 years I've lived behind that door, and my own boy walked through it like he was walking into a bank lobby. Sloan a half step ahead of him with a leather folder tucked under her arm and her heels clicking sharp across my floorboards. Elliot came in behind her with his shoulders up around his ears and a look on his face like a man walking into water he already knows is too cold. "Morning, Mom," he said. And he didn't come hug me. That was the second thing. Sloan set that folder down on my kitchen table like she was laying out a hand of cards. She didn't sit. She looked around my kitchen, at the cabinets I built, at Tom's old wall clock still ticking in the corner, and I watched her eyes do that thing again. That flick, that quiet arithmetic. Then she smiled at me, warm as a heat lamp, about that reel. "Marlene," she said, "we need to talk to you about some things, and I want you to hear us out before you react." Okay, I set my mug down slow. All right, I'm listening. She opened the folder. Elliot pulled out a chair and sat, but he sat wrong, on the edge of it, hands knotted together between his knees, staring at the table. My whole life that boy looked me in the eye, even when he was in trouble, especially when he was in trouble. He'd square up and take it. Now he couldn't lift his head, and that told me more than anything Sloan was about to say. "Mom," Elliot started, and his voice cracked a little. "The clinics, The clinic's in a rough spot. Sloan cut and smooth as a plane over soft pine. What Elliot's trying to say is that the practice took on some debt during the expansion, and the numbers haven't recovered the way we projected. It's serious, Marlene. We're talking about the kind of money that doesn't just work itself out. And we've been going around and around trying to find a way through it. And honestly, the only real asset in this family that makes sense is this property. There it was. I felt it land in my gut like a dropped stone. This place is 3 acres, she went on, and her voice picked up speed now, confident, rehearsed, and you're rattling around out here alone, in a house that's frankly too much for a woman your age to keep up. The maintenance, the property taxes, the isolation. It isn't safe, Marlene. God forbid you fall out in that workshop and nobody finds you for 2 days. That workshop, she said, like it was a hazard, like it wasn't the place I built her husband's whole childhood. I looked at my son, Elliot. What is she talking about? He opened his mouth and Sloan answered for him. We found you a wonderful place, she said. Meadowbrook. It's an assisted living community about 20 minutes from us, so we'd actually see you more. Isn't that nice? It's clean, it's safe, there's people your own age, activities, meals taken care of. And selling the property would clear the clinic's debt and set you up comfortable for whatever comes. It's the responsible thing. For everybody. She slid a glossy brochure across the table at me. Smiling gray-haired folks playing cards. A dining room that looked like a hotel nobody actually lived in. I didn't touch it. Come Monday, she added. We'd need to get things moving. There's a buyer already very interested. So the timeline's tight, but tight is good. Tight means you don't have to sit around dreading it. And that word, buyer, already. I felt the whole thing tilt. Now let me tell you what I did, because it isn't what I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was throw both of them out of my house and tell them to go straight to hell. 50 years of running a shop teaches you a few things, though. And one of them is that when you feel the anger come up hot and fast, that's exactly the moment you put the tool down and step back, because that's when a person loses fingers. So I didn't yell. I pulled out the chair across from my son and I sat down, and I reached over and I turned that folder around so it was facing me. Sloane's smile tightened at the corners. You don't have to read all that right now. Marlene, it's just the paperwork. We can walk you through it. I'm going to read it, I said. And I did. Slow. My reading glasses were out in the shop, so I held it at arm's length and squinted, and I made them sit there in the quiet while I did it. And I could feel Sloane vibrating across the table like a bandsaw somebody left running. Consent to list and sell. A page about the assisted living place. And then near the bottom of the stack, a sheet with a company name printed across the top that I'd never heard before in my life. Ridgeline Partners. And under it, a purchase agreement and a closing date. And that closing date was 2 weeks out. 2 weeks. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't a confused old woman seeing things. But there it was, plain as a knot in pine. A buyer with a name and an offer and a date, all of it lined up and ready to go, dated near a week before that Tuesday. Before anybody had said a single word to me. They hadn't come to my house to ask me anything. They'd come to get a signature on a deal that was already halfway closed. Somebody had been in a room with these Ridgeline people, negotiating the sale of the ground I've stood on for 40 years, while I was out in my shop, clamping up chair legs and thinking about my dead husband. I kept my face still. That's a thing you learn too, working with your hands. Your face doesn't have to show what the work is doing to you. Who's Ridgeline Partners? I said. Just a real estate firm, Sloane said. Too quick. They handle a lot of properties in the area. They're very reputable. It's a clean offer. Marlene, honestly, it's more than the place would get on the open market. You already got an offer, I said. Whole thing's dated last week. For a half second, nobody said anything. Then Sloane laughed, light, brushing it off her sleeve. I did some legwork ahead of time so we wouldn't be scrambling, she said. I didn't want to bring you a problem without a solution. That's all. That's what family does. family. She kept using that word like a shim, wedging it into every gap to hold her story level. I looked at my son again. Elliot, I said, and I waited until he finally lifted his eyes to mine. You okay with this? You want your mother out of this house by Monday. And Lord help me. I watched him swallow and I watched something miserable move behind his eyes. And he said, we just want what's best for you, Mom. It came out of him like a line he'd practiced in the truck on the way over. It didn't sound like my boy. It sounded like her, coming out of his mouth. I sat there a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. Tom's clock ticked in the corner. And I made a decision, though they didn't know it, sitting right there at that table. I wasn't going to fight them that morning. You don't fight a thing you don't understand yet. You measure it first. I need a few days, I said. Sloane's jaw set. Marlene, the timeline. I said I need a few days. I'm 72 years old, and I've owned this house longer than you've been alive. Young lady, and I'll be damned if I sign away 40 years in one morning over a cup of coffee. You want my name on something. You'll give me till the end of the week to sit with it. That's not me saying no. That's me saying I'm an old woman and I don't move fast. I could see her running the math on whether pushing harder would break something. She decided against it. She gathered herself back into that smooth smile and she said, of course, take a few days. But Marlene, please, don't drag it out. Elliot's under a lot of stress, and every week that passes makes it worse. She stood, smoothed her slacks, and left the folder sitting right there on my table, like she was sure enough of me to leave it behind. Elliot stood too. At the door, he stopped, and for just a second, he looked back at me. And I swear on my husband's grave, there was a boy in there somewhere trying to say something. His mouth opened. Then Sloane said his name from the porch, once light as anything, and he closed his mouth and he followed her out. The car started up and spun gravel and was gone. I sat at that table a long time after the sound of them faded off down Sumner Road. Then I got up, and I took that folder, and I carried it out to the shop. It was quiet out there the way it always is, the good quiet sawdust hanging gold in the window light. I set the folder on my workbench next to the chair legs I never did get to. And I stood there and I put my hand flat on the seat of that little rocking chair, the one I built for a red-faced hollering baby 41 years ago. And I turned it over and I ran my thumb over those 4 letters burned into the underside. E, J, W. And I'll tell you what I felt. It wasn't rage anymore. It had cooled down into something harder and clearer than rage. Because nobody builds a 2-week-old purchase agreement in one morning. My boy and his wife had been planning to move me out of my life for weeks, quiet, behind my back, and they'd only come to the house at the very end, when all that was left was to get the old fool to sign. Somebody was lying to me in my own kitchen, and I was done being listened past. I didn't know the half of it yet. I didn't know how deep it went, or who else had a hand in it, or the thing about my own name that was waiting for me just a few days down the road that would knock the wind clean out of me. But standing in my shop that afternoon with my hand on that little chair, I knew one thing for certain sure. They picked the wrong carpenter. Delia Pruitt lives 2 properties down from me, in a brick place her late husband left her. And if you'd asked me before all this, I'd have told you she was just the woman who brings over too many zucchini in August and waves at me from her mailbox. What I'd half forgotten, because she never made noise about it, was that Delia spent 30-some years as a lawyer over in the county seat. Estate work, elder law, that kind of thing. Retired maybe 6 years back. Sharp as a fresh blade, that woman, under all the gardening gloves and the zucchini. I walked down to her place that same afternoon with the folder under my arm. Didn't call first, just walked. She took one look at my face through the screen door, and she didn't say a word about it, just held the door open and put the kettle on. I laid the whole thing out on her kitchen table. The consent to sell, the Meadowbrook brochure, the Ridgeline agreement with that closing date sitting on it like a spider. I told her about the morning, about Elliot not looking at me, about Sloan and her family this and responsible that. Delia put her reading glasses on and she went through every page slow and careful, and she didn't interrupt me once. And when she got to the ridgeline sheet, she went real still. Marlene, she said, when did you first hear the name Ridgeline? Today, just today, off this paper. She nodded slow, tapping the closing date with one finger. And you never signed anything for your son or your daughter-in-law. No power of attorney. Nothing giving them authority over your affairs. Never, I said. Not once. Wouldn't even know how. She looked at me over the top of her glasses a long moment. Then she got up, went to a drawer, came back with a legal pad and a pen, and she said, I want you to think hard for me. In the last 6 months or a year, did anyone ever put a paper in front of you to sign? Anything at all? Even something that seemed like nothing. And that's when it came back to me, and my stomach dropped clean through the floor. Because there had been a paper. Back around Thanksgiving, Sloan had come by. Just her, said she was in the neighborhood, which she never was. And she'd sat at my kitchen table, being sweeter than I'd seen her in years, asking about the house, about my health, whether I had my affairs in order. And she'd pulled out a document, a couple pages, and slid it over and said it was some kind of updated insurance beneficiary form, that with Tom gone, I ought to have my paperwork current, and would I just sign at the tabs? And I'd almost done it. God help me, I had the pen in my hand, but something snagged. The thing was printed small and dense, and it didn't read like any insurance form I'd ever seen. And there was language in there about authority and acting on behalf of. And 50 years of reading contracts for lumber and custom jobs had put a little alarm bell in me that goes off when words are doing more than they're pretending to do. So I'd set the pen down and I'd told her I don't sign anything I haven't read twice with my glasses on. That's a rule I've had since before she was born, and I'd keep it and get back to her. She'd smiled and said no rush and gathered it up and left. And I never thought about it again. Not once until Delia asked. I told her all that. She wrote it down, and her mouth had gone into a thin, flat line. Marlene, she said, I want to be careful not to scare you before I know something for certain. But I'm going to make a couple of calls tomorrow, and I need your permission to do it. There are things I can check that you can't. Check what? I said. Whether anybody's already used your name, she said. Quiet. Whether there's a power of attorney out there with your signature on it that you never gave. I want to tell you I understood right away. I didn't. It took a second for it to travel through me. The idea that a person could just write your name and make it true on paper. When it landed, I had to put my cup down because my hand wasn't steady. She could do that, I said. Just sign my name. People do it every day, Delia said. It's more common than you'd ever believe, and it's most common inside families. That's the ugly part. It's almost always somebody who's supposed to love you. She reached over and put her hand on my arm, and she said, You may be wrong about all this, Marlene. I hope you are. But you were right to walk down here instead of signing anything. And you were right last Thanksgiving, too. Some part of you was already listening. Wood doesn't lie, I thought. You listen. It tells you everything. I didn't say it out loud. She'd have thought I was a sentimental old fool. Maybe I am one. She made her calls the next morning. By noon, she called me and asked me to come back down. And something in her voice put a stone in my chest before I ever got my boots on. When I sat down at her table again, she didn't dress it up. She'd learned to give bad news straight. 30 years of it. Marlene, she said, there's a power of attorney on file, drawn up 4 months ago, that grants Sloan authority to act on your financial affairs. It's got your signature on it, and it's notarized. And 2 weeks ago, it was presented to a bank and to a title company to move the sale of your product forward. I sat there. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower was going. I never signed that, I said. I know you didn't, she said. And that's the whole point. That signature is a forgery, Marlene. Somebody wrote your name, got it notarized somehow, and has been using it to sell your land out from under you without you ever knowing. That's not a family disagreement. That's not somebody making hard choices for an aging parent. That is a crime, a serious one. I've been hit by falling lumber before. Took a red oak beam across the shoulders once, dropped me flat, knocked the breath clean out of me so I lay there gasping like a fish. This was like that, except there wasn't any beam and there wasn't any floor. My own name. My son's wife had taken my own name, the name my father gave me, the name I burned into the underside of a baby's rocking chair, and she'd forged it onto a page and walked it into a bank. Does Elliot know? I said. It came out of me small. I don't know, Delia said, gentle. And I'd tell you not to assume, one way or the other, until we know more. But I noticed, too, he wouldn't look at you, but he came to the house. If he knew his wife had forged his own mother's signature, would he have been able to sit at that table at all? I hadn't thought of it like that. I turned it over. It was the first splinter of something I'd hang a lot of hope on later, but right then I couldn't feel hope. I could just feel the floor gone. Then Delia did what good people do in a crisis. She stopped letting me sink and she put a tool in my hand. Here's what we're going to do, she said, and she started ticking it off on her fingers. First, today, we lock your name down. There's a way to put a fraud alert and a title lock on your property so that not one more document can move on it without your say-so in person. That deal Sloane's got cooking with Ridgeline. We freeze it. Today, she can't close on a thing. All right, I said. Second, she said, we get your actual wishes on paper, the real thing, done right, so that no matter what happens, this land goes where you want it to go and nobody can touch that. And I know that ground's been in your family a long time. Have you thought about where you'd want it to end up? I thought about Junie, 6 years old, her grandfather's exact frown. I thought about 3 generations of Whitakers on that dirt. To my granddaughter, I said, to June, not to her mother, not to Elliot even, to the girl. Delia nodded like that was the right answer. We can do that, she said. There's a way to set it up so it passes straight to her and skips every hand you don't want it passing through. And third, she said, and here she looked at me hard. This is bigger than you and me and a title company now, Marlene. Forgery, notary, fraud, financial exploitation of an elder. That's not something you settle over Thanksgiving dinner. I have a call in to a detective I know who works these exact cases. Her name's Ruth Ambrose. I think you need to sit down with her. Not to blow your family up, to protect yourself. Because right now you are the victim of a crime, whether you're ready to call it that or not. I sat there in Delia Pruitt's kitchen, a carpenter who'd never so much as had a parking ticket, and I heard the word victim get set down next to my name, and I didn't much care for it. But I thought about that forged signature sitting in a bank. I thought about my boy who wouldn't meet my eyes. And I thought about Tom, 4 years in the ground, who saw all of this coming down the road before I ever did. All right, I said. Call your detective. Let's find out how deep this goes. Ruth Ambrose didn't look like what I'd pictured. I don't know what I pictured. Somebody in a suit off a TV show, maybe. What I got was a woman about 50 in a plain gray blazer and comfortable shoes, with the tired, steady eyes of a person who's seen the same sad thing happen 1,000 times and hasn't managed to stop caring about it, which is its own kind of tired. She came out to Delia's place so I wouldn't have to sit in a station, and she brought a folder of her own and a way of talking that was quiet and slow and never once made me feel like a foolish old woman. She let me tell it my way first. The Tuesday morning, the Ridgeline paper, Thanksgiving and the pen I set down, Delia's calls. She wrote a little, but mostly she just listened. And when I got to the part about the forged power of attorney, her face didn't change much. And I understood that was because none of it surprised her. Not one word. Mrs. Whitaker, she said when I was done. I'm going to be honest with you, because I think you're a woman who'd rather have it straight. What you're describing is one of the most common cases that crosses my desk, and it's also one of the ugliest. Because the people who do this are almost never strangers. Strangers are easy. You lock your door against a stranger. You don't lock your door against your own son's wife. No, I said. You don't. She asked my permission to look into a few things. Bank records the forged document had touched, the notary whose stamp was on it, the Ridgeline offer. I told her to look at whatever she needed to. And then she asked me a question that seemed like it came from nowhere. Has Sloan ever mentioned an older client, she said. Somebody she managed money for. Maybe somebody who passed away or dropped out of the picture. Anybody like that. I thought about it. No, I said. She didn't talk about her work much around me. Talked around it. Why? Ruth was quiet a second, deciding something. Then she said, because women who do this rarely do it once. The forgery, the fake authority, the rushed sale to a company that's already lined up. That's not a desperate person improvising to save her husband's clinic. That's a procedure. Somebody who's run the play before knows exactly which papers to forge and which notary won't ask questions and which buyer moves fast and quiet. First-timers make a mess. This isn't a mess. This is practiced. That word sat in Delia's kitchen and got heavier the longer it stayed. Practiced. It took Ruth about a week to come back to me, and when she did, she came out to my place. And she sat in my kitchen where the whole thing started, and she set down her folder and she said, I found something, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. There was a woman, she said. Her name is Winnie Kessler. She's 83 years old. 6 years back, she was a client of the firm Sloan worked for at the time, before Sloan went independent. Widow, no kids close by, some money, and a paid-off house over in the next county. And over about 2 years, control of Winnie Kessler's finances quietly moved into Sloan's hands. Power of attorney. Then her house was sold to a development company, and a big piece of her savings went sideways into places that are hard to trace. And by the time any of Winnie's people caught on, the money was mostly gone, and Winnie was in a state facility she never chose and didn't want. I felt sick, physically sick, sitting at my own table. Did she go to jail? I said. Sloan. Did anybody stop her? No, Ruth said, and I could hear the old frustration in it. It never got charged. Winnie was fragile by then, and a confused elderly witness is exactly what these cases die on. The firm settled a little money to make it quiet and cut ties with Sloan, and Sloan went out on her own, and everybody moved on. Except Winnie, who's still in that facility. And except me, because that case has been sitting in a drawer in my head for 6 years bothering me. And now here you are, Mrs. Whitaker. Same play, same woman. Sharper mark this time, somebody who put her pen down at Thanksgiving. I sat there and I thought about that other person I'd never met. Winnie Kessler, 83 in a facility she never picked. Her house sold, her money gone, and nobody ever answered for it. And I thought that was going to be me. That was the exact shape of the hole they had dug for me. And the only reason I wasn't already in it was that I'm a stubborn old carpenter who won't sign what she hasn't read twice. But here's the thing that changed everything in my chest, sitting there listening to Ruth. It wasn't fear anymore, and it wasn't even the rage. It was that this wasn't just about me now. There was an 83-year-old woman rotting in a facility because this had worked once, clean, and nobody stopped it. And if I rolled over, if I let my family and my shame talk me into settling this quiet, the way that firm settled Winnie quiet, then it'd just work again. On the next old fool down the road. There's always a next one. So that's for the courts now, I said. This Winnie business. It's not just my land anymore. This is a criminal thing. Ruth nodded. If the evidence holds the way I think it will, yes. The forged power of attorney on your property is already a serious felony on its own, but a documented pattern, a prior victim, that changes what this is. It stops being a sad private family matter that gets swept under a rug. It becomes a case. She looked at me steady. I have to ask you to be sure, though, because once this moves, it moves. If your son is tangled up in it, and I don't yet know that he is, But if he is, it will touch him too. I can't protect him from the truth. Nobody can. I thought about Elliot. I thought about the boy in that rocking chair asking me why the grain runs the way it runs. I thought about the man who came to my table and couldn't lift his eyes. I'll tell you what I told Ruth Ambrose. I said, my father taught me you don't force a split piece of wood back together and pretend it's whole. You either cut out the rot and save what's good, or you lose the whole board. I don't know yet how much of my boy is rot and how much is good, but I'm done pretending the board's fine. Do what you have to do. She gathered her folder and she stood. At the door she stopped and she said, for what it's worth, Mrs. Whitaker, in 15 years I've watched a lot of families choose the rug. Choose quiet. You're the first one in a long while to choose the hard thing. It matters. Winnie Kessler never got somebody who'd choose the hard thing. Then she was gone, and I stood in my kitchen in the last of the evening light, and I understood that we'd stopped playing defense. Delia had frozen the sale. My name was locked down. The land was set to pass to Junie no matter what. And now there was a detective with a 6-year-old ghost in her drawer building a real case, brick by brick, which meant there was only one thing left to do. I had to get them back in this house, both of them. And this time I wasn't going to sit there and read quiet while Sloane talked past me. This time I had the folder. This time I knew whose hand had signed my name. I picked up the phone and I called my son, and I kept my voice tired and beaten, the voice of an old woman who'd thought it over and given up. And I said, Elliot, I've been doing a lot of thinking, son. Bring Sloane by Friday. Bring the papers. I'm ready to sign. The line went quiet a second. Then he said, real careful. You sure, Mom? I'm sure, I said. I'm an old woman. You were right. It's too much house for me. I hung up and I stood there, and I was not proud of how easy the lie came. But some joints you cut in the open, and some you cut where the other fellow can't see. So the whole thing holds when the weight comes down. Friday. I had until Friday. Friday came in gray and low. One of those mornings that can't decide if it's going to rain. I was up before the light. I'd cleaned the house, which I hadn't done proper since Tom passed, and I couldn't tell you why, except that a person getting ready for a reckoning wants the ground swept. I set 4 chairs in the living room. I put my folder, face down on the side table by the fireplace, where I could reach it and they couldn't see it. Delia came at 9. Ruth Ambrose came a few minutes after, and she went into my bedroom off the hall and left the door cracked an inch. And she said, you won't need to do anything, Mrs. Whitaker. You just talk to them like we discussed. I'll know when. And I nodded, and my mouth was dry as sawdust. At 9:30, I heard the car turn in off Sumner Road. Same as Tuesday. Loose gravel, 2 doors slamming one after the other. But I stood different this time, over by the fireplace. And I had my boots on. They came in without knocking again. Sloane first, folder under her arm. And when she saw Delia sitting in my living room, her step hitched, just for a beat, before she smoothed it over. Elliot came behind her, and he looked worse than Tuesday, gray under the eyes, a man who hadn't been sleeping. Marlene, Sloane said, warm, recovering fast. I didn't know you'd have company. She looked at Delia. I'm sorry. I don't think we've met. This is my neighbor, I said. Delia. She's a friend. Thought I'd have a friend here, seeing as I'm signing away my house and all. Old woman gets sentimental. Something moved behind Sloane's eyes, quick a person recalculating. But she decided a nosy old neighbor was nothing to fear. She set her folder down on the coffee table and started laying out the pages. Well, she said, this won't take long, and then you can spend the day however you like. We really do appreciate you coming around to it, Marlene. I know it wasn't easy. She had the consent to sell. She had the Ridgeline agreement. She slid them toward me and held out a pen. A nice one, heavy, and she said, just where the tabs are. And I looked at that pen, and I looked at my son sitting on the edge of my couch, not able to look at me. and I did not take it. Sloan, I said, before I sign anything, I got one question, and I want you to look me in the eye and answer it, because we're family, and that's what you keep telling me. Family. Of course, she said. Anything. Whose hand signed my name 4 months ago, I said. The room changed temperature. I watched it hit her, watched the smile hold on her face, a half second too long past the point where it meant anything, like a clock that keeps ticking after it's fallen off the wall. I don't know what you mean, she said. I mean, there's a power of attorney sitting in a bank right now with my signature on it, I said, and I never signed it. I never gave you authority over one red cent of mine. And I sure as hell never met anybody named Ridgeline till you set their paper on my kitchen table. So I'll ask you again, and I'll say it slow. Whose hand signed my name? Sloan stood up out of that chair, and the color went out of her face like water out of a cracked jug. And Elliot's head came up off his hands, and he stared at her, and he said real quiet, Sloan, what is she talking about? What power of attorney? She didn't answer him. She was looking at me, and behind the fear, something harder was surfacing. The real thing, the thing under the heat lamp's smile. Delia stood then, calm as Sunday, and she took a single sheet off the side table, and she laid it on the coffee table facing them. This is a handwriting analysis, she said in the even voice of 30 years in courtrooms. It compares the signature on the power of attorney filed with First County Bank to Mrs. Whitaker's verified signature. The examiner's conclusion is that they were not made by the same hand. And this document, she set down a second page, is the title lock placed on the property 8 days ago, which means the sale you've scheduled to close next week, Miss Whitaker, cannot close. It hasn't been able to close for over a week. There is no deal. Sloane's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And then the bedroom door down the hall opened, and Ruth Ambrose came out with her badge on her belt, unhurried, and she said, Miss Whitaker, I'm Detective Ambrose. I'd like to talk with you. I have to tell you about my son now, because this is where the story breaks open in a way I didn't plan and couldn't have. Elliot came up off that couch like the cushion had burned him. Wait, he said. Wait, wait. He was looking between Ruth and Sloane and the papers on the table, and his voice was climbing. What is this? What forged? Sloane, tell them. Tell them you didn't. And when she didn't turn around, when she just stood there rigid with her back to him, I watched it go through my son like a current. I watched him get it. You told me, she agreed, Elliot said, and his voice cracked wide open. You sat in our kitchen and you told me Mom signed the POA months ago, that she wanted to help with the clinic, that she was fine with Meadowbrook. You told me she agreed to all of it. He grabbed the handwriting sheet off the table and stared at it like the words might rearrange. You forged her name. You forged my mother's name. Elliot, sit down, Sloane said. Lo, and there it was at last. The ice under the warmth. No more family this and responsible that. Just cold command. Sit down and let me handle this. But he didn't sit. He looked at the detective, at Delia, at me standing by the fireplace, and then he looked down at the ridgeline paper, and I saw him do the arithmetic he should have done weeks ago, and I watched the bottom drop out of him. There was never a buyer I found. He's mostly to himself. You brought Ridgeline. You had them before we ever. You told me you found them after Mom, and his voice failed. He turned to Ruth. Theirs is there. He couldn't get it out. Is this the first time? Has she done this before? And Ruth, who does not lie to make things easier, looked at him steady and said, No, doctor. Whitaker, it isn't. I have watched a lot of things break in my life. I've watched Greenwood split in the clamp when you rushed the glue. I've watched my husband go in a hospital bed. But I don't know that I've ever watched anything come apart the way my son came apart, standing in my living room, when he understood in one long, terrible minute that the woman he'd built his whole life around had lied to him, had used his name and his mother's love and his own good faith to run a thing she'd run before on some other old soul, and that he had carried her water right up to my kitchen table and called it doing best by me. He looked at me. My boy. 41 years old and he looked 7. Looked like the kid in the rocking chair. Mom, he said, I didn't know. I swear to God. I swear on Junie. I didn't know. And here's the thing I hadn't planned. I believed him. I'd walked into that Friday brace to find out my son was rot all the way through. And instead, I watched him find out the same time as everybody else. And no man is that good an actor. Not my Elliot, who never could look me in the eye when he'd done wrong. His wrong was that he didn't ask. He let her hand him a story about his own mother, and he swallowed it because swallowing it was easier than the questions. That's a real sin. But it isn't forging an old woman's name into a bank. It isn't Winnie Kessler. Sloan, I said, and I was surprised how quiet I could keep it. You should go on with the detective now. She turned and looked at me, finally, and the mask was all the way off. And what was underneath wasn't sorry. It was calculating even then, even cornered. Those eyes going over the room looking for the seam, the shim, the gap to wedge. She didn't find one. We'd cut this joint tight. She went with Ruth. She didn't say a word to Elliot on the way out. Not one. And that told him more than any of the rest of it. I think that in the worst moment of both their lives, she had nothing to spend on him, because he'd never been anything to her but a nice clean cover and a name that opened doors. He stood in the middle of my living room after the door closed and the car pulled away, and he shook, this grown man. This doctor shook like a leaf in a hard wind. I didn't go to him right off. I wanted to. Every part of a mother wants to. But some things a person has to stand inside of by themselves for a minute before anybody can reach them. So I let the quiet hold him, and I went to the kitchen, and I filled a glass with water, and I carried it back and set it down on the table beside him without a word. It was the same thing my father would have done. You don't fix the break while the wood's still moving. You wait for it to settle. Then you see what's left to save. Elliot didn't drink the water. He just stood there over it for a long while. And then his legs kind of gave, and he sat down hard on the couch and put his face in his hands. And he stayed like that. I sat down across from him in the chair I'd set out that morning, and I didn't say anything. Because there wasn't a thing to say that would have been worth more than the quiet. After a bit, he said, through his hands, "How long have you known?" "About a week and a half," I said. "Since Delia and the detective ran it down. Long enough to be ready for this morning." He nodded slow, not looking up. "You lied to me on the phone," he said, "about being ready to sign. It wasn't an accusation. It was a man taking the measure of how far things had gone. His own mother laying a trap for him in the house he grew up in. I did," I said. "I'm not going to apologize for it either, son. You want to know why I had to trick my own boy into this room? That's a question you're going to be chewing on a long time, and I think you already know the answers. You'd have warned her, not because you're wicked, because a week ago you still thought the lie was the truth." He flinched at that, but he didn't argue it, because it was true. And somewhere under all the wreckage, my boy was still honest enough to know when a thing was true. After a while, he got up and he walked out, didn't say where. I watched through the window as he crossed the yard, slow hands jammed in his pockets, and he went into the shop. My shop. He stayed out there a long time. I gave him an hour, then I went out too. He was sitting on the stool at my workbench with the little rocking chair in his lap. He'd turned it over. He was running his thumb over those 4 letters burned into the underside the way I do. J. W and the date. And I could see he'd been crying out there where nobody could watch, the way men his stripes still think they have to. "I didn't know you kept this," he said. "Kept everything," I said. "It's a shop. Nothing leaves." He turned it right side up and set it on the bench, gentle, and he looked around at the place, at the tools on the wall, each in its outline, at the sawdust in the window light. And he said, real low, "I used to be somebody in here. When I was a kid, I knew who I was in this room." He laughed, but it came out broken. "I don't know when I stopped knowing." "I've got a guess," I said. He looked at me. "When you started letting somebody else tell you who you were," I said. That's usually when a person loses the thread. Wasn't all her, Elliot. A man doesn't get talked out of his own mother unless some part of him was willing to be talked out of it. You wanted the clinic saved bad enough that you didn't ask the questions a grown man asks. She handed you a story where you got to keep everything, and I got taken care of, and nobody had to feel bad, and you took it because it was easier than the truth. That's the sin here. Not that you're cruel, that you took the easy board when you knew. You knew it had rot in it. He didn't say anything for a bit. Then he said, "What happens to her now?" "That's the detective's to say, not mine," I told him. "There's the forgery on my land, and there's the other woman, the one before me. Winnie Kessler, 83 years old, in a facility she didn't choose. House sold, money gone, and Sloan did that sicker's back and walked clean away because nobody would fight it. Your wife's been doing this a while, son. I'm sorry. I know that's a hell of a thing to set on you all at once. I watched that land on him too, the other woman. Because up till then, I think, some corner of Elliot had still been holding on to the idea that this was a one-time desperate thing, that his wife had done a terrible thing out of fear for the clinic, for the family. And that terrible fear was at least a thing you could understand and maybe someday forgive. Winnie Kessler took that away from him. You don't do it twice out of fear. Twice is who you are. Now I have to tell you about the days that came after, because this is the part that near killed me, and it's the part I'm least sure I did right, and I've decided to tell it straight even so. Sloan wasn't arrested and hauled off in cuffs that Friday. That's television. But Ruth's case moved, brick by brick, the way she said it would. And it moved fast once the Winnie Kessler file came out of the drawer and got dusted off. Because a pattern is a thing prosecutors can hold on to. Charges came: forgery, notary fraud, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, and once they reopened the old case more. Sloan got herself a good lawyer, the expensive kind, and she fought. And it dragged on for months in a way that court things do. But the ground had shifted under her, and she knew it. And everybody in it knew it. And she ran. Not in the fugitive sense. Her lawyer wouldn't have allowed that. She ran from Elliot, filed the divorce herself, quick, cold, from a distance, through paper. And when it came to Junie, she fought for the girl the exact way she fought for everything. As an asset, a thing with value, a chip. But here's what undid her. A woman charged with forging documents and looting an elderly widow does not make a sympathetic case for custody. And Ruth's file, the whole ugly pattern of it, laid out plain, did more for my son in that courtroom than any lawyer could have. When the dust settled, Elliot had Junie, full custody, near enough. Sloan got supervised visits she mostly didn't bother to show for, because a child you can't turn into money isn't worth her time. My son found that out slow and terrible, watching his little girl wait at a window for a mother who wasn't coming. I won't pretend I was sorry to see Sloan gone from our lives. I'd be lying, and I quit lying to you back in the shop. But I want to be honest about the shape of it, because the storytellers who do this kind of tale always want the villain to weep and repent at the end, to sit down and cry and turn good. And that is not what happened, and it is not what happens. Sloan never once said she was sorry. Not to me, not to Elliot, not to that 83-year-old woman. Right to the end, her only expression was calculation, working the angles, looking for the seam. Some people are a piece of wood with the rot gone all the way to the core, and there's no joint you can cut that'll hold. And the only wise thing to do is stop trying to build with it and set it aside. That's not bitterness talking. It's 40 years of learning which boards to trust. Now here's the part that near killed me. Elliot lost the clinic. It was already bleeding when this all started. That part of the story Sloan told was true, even if everything around it was a lie. And with her charged and the marriage blown apart, and his name, however innocent, tangled all through the mess in the eyes of a small county where everybody talks, the practice couldn't survive it. The debt came due. The bank took what the bank takes. My son, 41 years old, a good doctor, A man who used to know every patient by their first name, lost the thing he'd built his whole adult life around, and stood in the ruins of it with a 6-year-old girl to raise and nothing much left. And I had the money to save him. I want you to sit with that a minute the way I had to sit with it, night after night. Because when Tom passed, he left me comfortable, more than folks would guess to look at me. 40 years of a paid-off house and careful living, and 2 people who never spent what they didn't have, and the land that ground under my feet. In a town Ridgeline and their kind were circling, because it's worth real money now. More money than a carpenter has any business sitting on. I could have written a check. I could have cleared his debt and set him back up and made the whole hard landing soft. What's a mother for, if not that? I didn't do it. Lord, the nights I sat out in that shop with the wood stove going and turned it over. I'd think about Elliot as a boy in that rocking chair, and I'd think, just help him, you old fool. He's your son. He's suffered enough. Hasn't he suffered enough? My hand would be halfway to the phone. And then I'd make myself remember something. I'd make myself remember that the reason my boy got talked out of his own mother was that somewhere along the line he'd come to believe that when things got bad enough, money would appear and fix it. Sloan believed that about my land. And Elliot, God love him, had come to half believe it too, that Mom's place was a kind of insurance, a thing that would catch him if he fell far enough. That belief was the very rot. And if I wrote that check, if I made the fall soft, I would be pouring glue into the exact crack that had let all this in. I'd be teaching him one more time that he never had to hit the ground, that somebody would always be under him. And a man who's never once hit the ground never learns that his own trudged 2 legs will hold. Winnie Kessler didn't have anybody who'd let her fall and stand back up. She had people who either fleeced her or, before that, people who gave her whatever she asked and taught her nothing. My father used to say the cruelest thing you can do to Greenwood is never let it dry, never let it take a load, keep it soft and easy. And then one day the weight comes and it splits because it was never seasoned. I'd raised a son. I'd seasoned him once, in that shop, in those years. And then I'd let a woman keep him soft for a decade. This was the drying. It was going to hurt. Drying always cracks a little wood you wish it hadn't. So I let my son lose the clinic. I sat in a room I could have fixed everything from, and I did not fix it. And I let him feel the whole weight come down. But hear me. Letting a man fall is not the same as leaving him. That's the line. And it's a fine one. And I damn near got it wrong more than once. I didn't write a check, but I called Elliot the week the bank finished taking the clinic. And I said, you and Junie, you're going to need a place. This house has got more rooms than an old woman uses. Come home, not as charity. I could use the help. My knees aren't what they were, and that ground needs more than I can give it. Come home and work. There was a long quiet on the line. Then my son said, in a voice I hadn't heard from him since he was small, okay, Mom, okay. And a few days later, a truck I didn't recognize, cheap, 10 years old, all he had left, pulled in off Sumner Road. Slow this time, careful over the gravel. And Junie tumbled out of it with her grandfather's exact frown. And my son stood in my yard with a couple of boxes and a folded-up life. And he looked at me across the grass, like he didn't know if he had the right to be there. I walked over and I took a box out of his hands and I said, shop's a mess. Always is. You remember where the broom is. He almost laughed. It caught in his throat and came out as something else. And he ducked his head. And he carried his little girl's things into the house he grew up in. That night, after Junie was asleep in what used to be Elliot's boyhood room, he came out to the shop where I was banking the stove. And he stood in the doorway a while. And then he said, I don't know how to start over, Mom. I'm 41. I lost everything. I don't even know what I am anymore if I'm not that. And I handed him a broom. You start here, I said. You sweep the floor. Then tomorrow you sweep it again. A shop don't get clean once and stay clean. It gets clean every day or it don't get clean at all. And a life's the same. You don't rebuild it in a grand gesture, son. You rebuild it one swept floor at a time, till one day you look up and you're somebody again. He took the broom, and my boy, the doctor, the man who lost everything, started sweeping the sawdust off my shop floor in the low orange light of the wood stove. Slow, and neither of us said anything, and it was the closest I'd felt to him in 10 years. The seasons changed while my son learned to use his hands again. It was slow, and I want to tell it slow, because the slow is the whole point. Elliot didn't walk into that shop and become a carpenter. That's not how it goes. And any story that tells you a man rebuilds himself in a montage is selling you something. What happened was he swept the floor, and then he learned to sharpen a chisel, and he did it wrong. And I let him do it wrong until he figured out why the edge kept rolling. Because a thing you work out yourself stays worked out. He mashed his thumb with a mallet the first week and cussed in a way that would have made his father put down his coffee. And I laughed. And he looked at me startled. And then he laughed too. And that was the first real laugh I'd heard out of him in longer than I could say. He picked up work where he could. A county like ours always needs a doctor, even part-time. And once the dust of the trial settled and folks understood he'd been a fool and not a thief, the clinic in the next town over took him on. Salaried, no ownership, no debt, no empire. Just a man seeing patients and knowing their first names again. It paid a fraction of what he used to clear. He didn't seem to mind that near as much as I'd have guessed. A man who's had everything and lost it comes out the other side caring about a different set of things, if he comes out right. Mornings he doctored. Evenings and weekends he was in the shop with me. And slowly, board by board, he got some of himself back. Junie took to the place like she'd been born in the sawdust, the way her daddy was. 6 going on 7, sharp as a tack, forever underfoot with 1,000 questions. Why does the grain run this way, Grandma? Why does some wood split mean and some wood bend sweet? I about had to sit down the first time she asked it, word for word almost, out of a mouth that didn't know it was quoting a man 40 years dead. It runs the way it grew, baby, I told her. You can't make it run different. You can only learn which way it wants to go and cut with it. She frowned her grandfather's frown and filed that away somewhere. And I thought, well, there it goes. The thread doesn't break after all. It just skips a hand sometimes. Now I have to tell you about the land, because Delia and I had done a thing months back that I hadn't told a soul about, not even Elliot. You'll remember the second thing Delia set out to do. Back in her kitchen the day the floor fell out from under me. Lock the name, get the wishes on paper, call the detective. The middle one I'd let sit while everything else played out. But it was done, filed real. And on a Sunday that spring, I asked Delia to come by, and I sat Elliot down at the kitchen table where all of this had started, in the chair where his wife once slid a forged form at me and called it insurance, and I put a folder in front of him. My folder. He looked at it like it might bite. We didn't have great luck last time somebody put a folder on this table, he said, and there was enough of the old Elliot in the joke that it eased my chest. Open it, I said. He did, and he read slow the way I'd taught him without ever meaning to, and I watched his face change as he understood what he was looking at. It was a transfer on death deed. The land, all 3 acres, the house, the shop, set to pass on my death straight to June Whitaker, not to Elliot, to Junie. And past that, a second document, one Delia had walked me through careful, that put a permanent restriction on the ground so that no matter who held it, no matter what anybody was ever offered, it could never be carved up and sold off to a ridgeline, never turned into a strip of shops or a row of houses. Locked. For good. Elliot set it down. He was quiet a long time. You skipped me, he said. Not hurt. Working it out. I did, I said. And I want you to understand why. Because it's the same lesson twice, and I'd rather say it plain than let you wonder. This place isn't an inheritance, son. It's not money sitting out here waiting to catch somebody who falls. That's exactly what it got treated as, and look what that nearly cost us all. So I fixed it so it can't be that ever again. It can't be sold. It can't be cashed out. It can't save anybody from a bad decision. because the day it can, it starts drawing the wolves back. It goes to Junie because Junie's 6, and by the time it's hers, she'll have grown up in that shop the way you did, the way I did, and she'll know it for what it is. A place, not a number. He nodded, slow, and I saw him swallow. And what am I? Then, he said. Quiet. If it's not mine. You're the man who keeps it till it's hers, I said. You're the hand it skips through. That's not nothing, Elliot. That's the whole job. Matter of fact, my daddy kept this ground so I could have it. I kept it so. Well, so it'd get treated like an ATM by somebody who married in. But that's on me for not locking it sooner. Now you keep it for her. That's what the land's for. That's what any of it's for. You don't own a thing like this. You just carry it a little ways and hand it on cleaner than you got it. He put his hand flat on that folder and he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, real low, Dad knew. About Sloan. He said something to you, didn't he? Years ago. He did, I said. He saw it before any of us. I didn't listen. He nodded, and his eyes were wet, and he said, I wish I'd listened to you the way you wish you'd listened to him. We're a family of people who learn late, I told him. Whole line of us. Maybe Junie breaks the streak. Now here is the moment I'd trade a good many things to have Tom seen. It came on an ordinary evening late that summer. Gold light through the shop window the way it gets, sawdust hanging in it. Elliot was at the bench working a joint I'd set him, a mortise and tenon. The first one I ever taught him, and the one I'd made him do over 3 times because it wasn't tight. And Junie was banging around the shop the way she does, and she went quiet, which with that child means trouble. And I looked over. She'd found the little rocking chair. It had sat in the corner of that shop the better part of 40 years. And without asking anybody, the way 6-year-olds do, she'd climbed right into it, and she was rocking, slow running her small hands along the smooth curved arms, perfectly at home, like it had been built for her, which in a manner of speaking it finally had. Elliot saw where I was looking, and he turned, and he went still. That's, he started, and stopped. I built it for you, I said. Before you were born, you spent about 1,000 hours in that chair asking me why the sky's blue and why wood does what it does. He set down his tools. He walked over, and he knelt down by his daughter in that chair, and he reached under it, and he tipped it back just gentle enough not to spill her, and he looked at the underside, and he found what I burned there 41 years ago. E. J. W. And the date, his own initials, his own birthday, in his mother's hand, under a chair he'd forgotten he ever sat in. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. He just knelt there on the sawdust floor with one hand steadying his little girl and the other flat against those 4 burned letters. And his shoulders went, and my son cried, quiet, in the shop where he became somebody the first time and was becoming somebody again. And I'll tell you, so there's no fairy tale in it, because I promised you straight all the way through. It was not all mended. It never got all mended. There's 10 years of drift you don't fully close, and there's a woman's forged signature you don't ever quite forget was aimed at you. And there were nights still where Elliot and I sat in a silence that had something unspoken in it, some grief over the years we lost that neither of us had the words to lift. A mother and a son who nearly came apart don't snap back seamless like green wood. They mend like a good glued joint mends, which is to say the line always shows if you know where to look. You can run your thumb right over the seam. But here's the thing about a joint mended right. It holds. It holds tighter than the wood around it. Matter of fact, tighter than it ever held before it broke. Because now there's understanding in it where before there was just habit. Junie rocked in that chair. Elliot knelt with his hand on his own name. The light came gold through the sawdust the way it had for 40 years. And 3 generations of Whitakers were in that shop at one time, which is all I ever really wanted and more than I had any right to expect after the year we'd had. I went back to my bench, and I let them have that minute, the 2 of them, and I ran my hand over the workbench worn smooth in the middle. and I thought about Tom, and I thought, all right, old man, I got there slow, but I got there. I'm an old woman in a workshop, and I've built furniture my whole life. So let me leave you with the truest thing I know. The joints that last aren't the ones held with glue and a prayer. They're the ones cut deep, wood locked into wood, the kind that only grip harder the more weight you put on them. People are the same. Loving somebody, really loving them. Sometimes it means letting them take the weight, letting them fall, and standing close enough that they know they're not alone without reaching out to catch them. Because a person who never once hits the ground never learns their own legs will hold. I could have written a check and saved my boy from every hard thing. It would have been the easy board, and it would have split us both. In the end, I didn't get to keep everything. I lost some years with my son I'll never get back, but the land's set right, the shop's still standing, and my granddaughter's asleep in the house her daddy grew up in. That's the whole inheritance. Not the money, not the acres. A child rocking in a chair her father once sat in. Leave that clean for the next hand, and you've done your work. What'll you leave behind? Tell me down in the comments. I'll be reading.